Question from Fraser in the UK. Dear Dr. Craig, first of all, I would like to thank you for your ministry, as your defense of Christianity has been very encouraging for myself and many of my friends. My questions concern both premises of the Kalam Cosmological argument as you defended it. Of course, premise one, everything that begins to exist has a cause. It seems to me that this premise is unjustified, as this is not the causal principle we see in the world. It seems to me that the only causal relations we see in the world are ones that change the orientation of existing entities. For example, when someone fashions a chair out of wood, this is not really a chair coming into being, but a rearrangement of the pre-existing wood. Following this train of thought, it seems as though whenever we see something coming into existence, it is really just a rearrangement of the fundamental constituent quarks and leptons. How then are you justified in saying that this first premise is true when it has never been observed and does not bear any relation to the normal causal principle at work? Say, when a tea bag is placed into hot water, it causes the cup of tea to change from being a cup of boiling water into a cup of tea.
All right, this is a question that we have addressed over and over again, but it seems the lesson is difficult to learn and it keeps coming up. So let me say something about it again. He misinterprets the first premise to be saying that everything that begins to exist ex nihilo has a cause, that everything that begins to exist out of nothing has a cause. And that's not at all what the first premise is talking about. It's just talking about something that begins to exist. And I would disagree with Fraser when he says that a chair doesn't really come into being. That is patently false. When a carpenter makes a chair out of pre-existing wood, the chair comes into existence at that point. It begins to exist. If you deny that, then I would ask you to tell me, where was the chair before the carpenter began to do his work? Has that chair been around? If so, why haven't we seen it? Or think of your own existence. Did you exist prior to your conception? If so, where were you then before your parents met? Where were you during the Jurassic Age when the dinosaurs were about? It's patently obvious that things begin to exist. And this premise doesn't require that they begin to exist out of nothing. Indeed, the premise is quite consistent with the cause being either a material cause or an efficient cause. Now, I was thinking of efficient causes when I enunciated the premise. Everything that begins to exist must have an efficient cause. The chair that begins to exist must have a carpenter who makes it. The person who begins to exist must have parents who conceive him. But it's entirely compatible with saying that there needs to be material causes as well. Wood out of which the chair is made, sperm and egg out of which the person is conceived. So this first premise is entirely open with respect to the nature of the cause. It simply says that everything that begins to exist has to have a cause. And I don't think Fraser would want to deny that. I think he would agree with it. The question is, when you get to the case of the universe began to exist, the argument proves that the universe has a cause. Now, the question is, what kind of cause is it? Is it an efficient cause, or is it a material cause? And here it clearly cannot be a material cause, because the beginning of the universe involves the beginning, the origin of all matter and energy. All matter and energy come to exist at the beginning of the universe. And therefore, the cause of the universe that the argument concludes to cannot be a material cause. It can be, at best, an efficient cause. So there's simply no problem here with the premise. The premise is supported by both philosophical argument and the best of inductive evidence, and there's simply no reason to think that this premise is unjustified.
And you pointed out that this principle is a metaphysical principle.
Yes, that's why I said there are philosophical arguments and not just inductive evidence for this premise. I find it odd that folks are so focused on the inductive evidence that as you look around, everything that begins to exist has a cause. But they don't seem to grasp the metaphysical principle that is at issue here, and that is that things don't just spring into being from nothing. They need to have a cause of some sort that brings them into existence, whether it's efficient or material or formal or final. Some sort of cause has to explain why something like a chair or a person begins to exist. So I think the metaphysical arguments or considerations for this premise are far more important than the inductive evidence, though the inductive evidence does support the premise.
Yeah, the objector usually says something along the lines of, prior to the universe's creation, since there were no physical laws or things like that, then all bets are off, and you can't apply number one.
That's a different objection, and that is assuming, as you say, that the causal principle is merely like a law of nature, a physical law, like the second law of thermodynamics or Boyle's gas laws or something of that sort. But it's not a physical principle. You will not find any scientific theory that includes this premise as an axiom of the theory. This is rather a presupposition. It's a metaphysical presupposition of science and I think of philosophy that applies to everything that exists. Consider now then objections to the second premise, that the universe began to exist. Objection number 6, nothing ever begins to exist, for the material of which a thing consists precedes it. So it is not true that the universe began to exist. Response to number 6. I think this is my favorite bad objection, since the assertion that nothing ever begins to exist is so patently ridiculous. Did I exist before I was conceived? If so, where was I? What was I doing during the Jurassic period? Has the World Trade Center always existed? If so, why didn't the Native American Indians notice it? This objection obviously confuses a thing with the matter or stuff of which the thing is made. Just because the stuff of which something was made has always existed doesn't imply that the thing itself has always existed. Now, since writing this talk, it has occurred to me that the objector could save himself from the embarrassment of affirming that he has always existed by adopting what's called mereological nihilism, which is the view that there are no composite objects. That is to say, all that exists are just fundamental particles which are arranged in various ways. So in fact, there really are no chairs or tables or horses or people or palm trees. There are just fundamental particles which are arranged chair-wise or table-wise or people-wise. And so in denying that he ever began to exist, the objector isn't affirming that he's always existed. Rather, what he's denying is that he ever does exist. So in this case, the cure is really worse than the disease, because now instead of saying he has always existed, what the objector has to say is that he doesn't exist. The objector literally does not exist. Now, if that's the case, then it might make us wonder why we should bother responding to him if he doesn't exist. What this implies is that, in fact, nobody, literally nobody, has ever raised this objection, because there aren't any people. But this is surely absurd. Am I to affirm that I do not exist? It reminds me of the undergraduate student who had been reading Descartes and burst into his professor's office early one morning, bleary-eyed and unshaven. Obviously, he had been up all night. He was very distraught, and he said, "Professor, tell me, do I exist?" And the professor looked at him and said, "Who wants to know?" The idea that one does not exist is surely metaphysically absurd. So that it seems to me that this is simply to jump out of the frying pan into the fire. Well, the serious point of this muddled objection, I think, is its presupposition that everything that begins has a material cause. But that claim is irrelevant to the truth of the two premises of the Kalam cosmological argument, and it would require proof in any case. Now, it is true, I think, that in our experience, material things do not begin to exist without material causes. So we do have the same sort of inductive evidence on behalf of material causation as we have for efficient causation. But if we have good arguments and evidence that the material realm had an absolute beginning preceded by nothing, this can override the inductive evidence. What we cannot reasonably say, I think, is that the universe sprang into being without either an efficient or a material cause, since being does not come from non-being. But there's no sort of metaphysical absurdity involved in something's having an efficient cause, but no material cause.
Okay. I believe it was objection number 6, talking about the things don't actually come into existence.
Yes.
And you had given the possibility of the mereological
Nihilism.
But is that really even, according to the quote you gave by Plato, is that even possible? Because it speaks of changing and alteration as well, needing a cause. And so even if it's just an arrangement of particles, those particles still change to different arrangements. And so
yes,
would they have to avoid it, would they have to devolve all the way to a sort of pantheism where there actually is no distinction in any kind of entity?
Well, this is a very good question, and I was ad-libbing at that point in my lecture this evening, and I had intended to say a further comment, but I neglected because I didn't have notes. And that is, we can actually reformulate or rephrase the Kalam argument to meet the scruples of the mereological nihilist. And it would go like this. If fundamental particles arranged universe-wise begin to exist, they have a cause. Premise 2, the fundamental particles arranged universe-wise began to exist. 3, therefore, the fundamental particles arranged universe-wise have a cause. So you can simply reformulate the argument to meet the demands of the mereological nihilist, whose view in any case I think is absolutely mad. As I say, I at least exist, even if nothing else does. But we can rephrase the argument in such a way as to not assume that the universe is a composite object.